For 3 long years, Ridgeville's residents relentlessly ridiculed Tristan Penfield, dubbing him the Tin Can Lunatic. His perceived crime was erecting a bizarre rusted steel Quonset hut entirely over his perfectly functional wooden cabin, alongside his insistence that the hollow space between the metals would one day save his life. The laughter died abruptly, however, when the historic deep freeze of 2024 struck. As lethal -60-degree temperatures decimated the regional power grid and forced families to burn their own furniture just to survive the night in freezing living rooms, Tristan relaxed in a t-shirt. Far from a joke, his apocalyptic tin can retained 55 degrees more heat than any other home in the state. This is the unbelievable true story of one man's obsession becoming a town's sole salvation. The rhythmic, deafening clang of steel on steel echoed through the Bitterroot Valley for the entirety of the summer. It was a sound that carried across the pine-studded hills and directly into the living rooms of Ridgeville, Montana, much to the deep annoyance of the local residents. At the center of this metallic symphony was Tristan Penfield. At 64, Tristan was a retired structural engineer whose face bore the deep weathered lines of a man who had spent too much time staring down the elements and too much time carrying the weight of a profound tragedy. 7 years earlier, Tristan had lost his wife, Nora. It wasn't a disease or a car accident that took her. It was the cold. During a freak blizzard that trapped them in their car on a remote mountain pass, the heater had failed. By the time the rescue crews dug them out 3 days later, Nora was gone. Tristan survived losing 2 toes to frostbite, but the real damage was inflicted on his mind. The cold was no longer just weather to Tristan. It was a living, breathing predator, and he was determined to never let it bite him again. When Tristan bought a 5-acre plot on the outskirts of Ridgeville, he started by building a modest, well-insulated, single-story timber cabin. The townsfolk, a tight-knit community of loggers, ranchers, and retirees, welcomed him warmly enough. Sarah Jenkins, who ran the local diner, would often bring him leftover cherry pie, and Mayor Thomas Buckley even invited him to the annual summer barbecue. Tristan was quiet, polite, and kept to himself. But then the trucks arrived. Massive flatbeds rumbled up Tristan's gravel driveway carrying heavily corrugated galvanized steel panels. They were military surplus components for a massive Quonset hut, the kind of semicircular rib structures used during World War II for aircraft hangars and barracks. Within weeks, Tristan began assembling the colossal steel arch directly over his freshly built timber cabin. He left exactly a 4-foot gap between the outer walls of the wooden cabin and the inner curvature of the steel Quonset shell. He installed thick double-paned polycarbonate panels on the south-facing side of the steel structure to allow sunlight in while leaving the northeast and west sides completely encased in solid metal. The town was bewildered. What in God's name is he doing up there? Mayor Buckley muttered one morning at Sarah's diner, staring out the window toward Tristan's property. He's building a damn bomb shelter over a perfectly good house. It looks like a crashed Zeppelin. Greg Mitchell, a local general contractor who prided himself on building traditional sturdy Montana log homes, scoffed loudly into his coffee mug. It's an eyesore, Tom. The guy is a crackpot. He told me last week he's building a macro-thermal envelope. I told him he's building a rust bucket that's going to drop our property values by 20%. The mockery quickly escalated. Teenagers started driving by Tristan's property, throwing empty beer cans at the metal shell to hear them ring, yelling, "Hey, Artie," expecting a nuclear strike. The local paper ran a tongue-in-cheek editorial about the Ridgeville tin can. Through it all, Tristan remained stoic and aggressively focused. He meticulously sealed every seam of the Quonset hut with industrial-grade polyurethane foam. Inside the 4-foot gap between the cabin and the metal shell, which he called the atrium, he stacked hundreds of black 55-gallon drums filled with water. He installed manual vents near the base of the steel structure and louvers at the very top. Sarah Jenkins, feeling a pang of pity, drove up to his property one brisk October afternoon. She found Tristan caulking a massive reinforced steel door that served as the primary entrance through the Quonset shell. "Tristan, people are talking. Sarah said gently, handing him a foil-wrapped slice of meatloaf. The Homeowners Association is pressuring the mayor to cite you for zoning violations. Why are you doing this? It's a bit extreme, don't you think? Tristan paused, wiping a smudge of grease from his forehead. He looked at Sarah, his pale blue eyes deadly serious. Sarah, conventional houses fight the cold by burning energy. But when the grid goes down, and a conventional house becomes a wooden refrigerator, the cold always wins if you fight it with machines. He patted the thick steel of the Quonset. This isn't a house, it's a thermos. The polycarbonate windows let the winter sun heat the air in the gap. The black water barrels absorb that heat. When the sun goes down, the barrels radiate the heat back into the air gap. My wooden cabin sits inside a bubble of warm, still air. The wind can howl at 80 miles an hour against this steel, and I won't feel a breeze. It's passive physics. Sarah offered a polite, strained smile. Well, just make sure you don't cook yourself in there. Tristan watched her drive away, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. They didn't understand. They trusted the power lines strung precariously through the snow-heavy pines. They trusted the natural gas pipelines that could freeze. They trusted a fragile web of infrastructure that Tristan knew could snap like dry twigs. He turned back to his heavy steel door. Winter was coming, and Tristan's bones told him it was going to be a monster. By early January, the mockery had faded into a dull, lingering resentment. The tin can was a fixture of the Ridgeville landscape, a metallic eyesore gleaming dully under the gray winter skies. The town had largely moved on, distracted by the approaching holiday fatigue and the daily grind of deep winter maintenance. But halfway across the globe, high above the Arctic Circle, a catastrophic meteorological anomaly was taking shape. The polar vortex, a massive expanse of swirling freezing air that normally stays confined to the North Pole, began to destabilize. A sudden stratospheric warming event caused the vortex to split, sending a jagged, terrifyingly cold lobe of dense frigid air plunging straight down through Canada and aiming directly at the American Northwest. Meteorologists on the news looked grim. The National Weather Service issued warnings that sounded more like apocalyptic prophecies: generational cold, life-threatening wind chills, infrastructure failure imminent. In Ridgeville, the reaction was a mix of stubborn bravado and mild irritation. These were Montana mountain folk. They were used to snow and ice. At Miller's Hardware on Main Street, the aisles were packed, but the mood was surprisingly light. People were buying extra rock salt, a few backup snow shovels, and the occasional electric space heater. Tristan walked into the store, pulling a heavy canvas sled behind him. He didn't buy salt or space heaters. He bought rolls of thick mylar reflective tape, 6 commercial-grade fire extinguishers, and 50 pounds of dried rice and beans. Greg Mitchell was standing at the checkout counter, ringing up 3 cheap plastic electric heaters. He looked at Tristan's pile of survival goods and smirked. Gearing up for the end of the world, Tristan. Greg asked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the other shoppers. You think that tin can of yours is going to keep out a 50 below freeze metal conducts cold, you know. You're going to freeze faster than a popsicle in that thing. Tristan paid for his items, deliberately ignoring the snickers from the line behind him. He looked directly at the cheap electric heaters in Greg's hands. Those require electricity, Greg, Tristan said quietly. When the substation at Miller's Creek freezes over and the lines snap from the ice load, those plastic boxes are going to be nothing but expensive paperweights. Greg's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl. The grid here is robust, old man. We've handled 40 below before. We'll be fine. You just worry about your own rusted bunker. I am, Tristan replied softly. He loaded his supplies into his truck and drove back up the mountain. When Tristan arrived home, he went to work. The sky was already turning a bruised, unnatural purple. The air was dead still, the terrifying silence that always precedes a massive pressure drop. He walked into the 4-foot atrium between his cabin and the steel shell. The temperature inside the gap was a comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit, heated entirely by the weak winter sun shining through the south-facing polycarbonate panels and the ambient radiation from the hundreds of water barrels. Inside his actual wooden cabin, it was a cozy 70 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring nothing more than a small, highly efficient wood stove, burning a single log every few hours. Tristan began applying the mylar tape over the tiny microscopic seams in the Quonset's inner walls, ensuring an absolute hermetic seal against drafts. He checked the mechanical linkages on the roof louvers, lubricating them with graphite powder so they wouldn't freeze shut. He chopped an extra cord of wood and stacked it in the atrium perfectly dry and ready. Down in the valley, the town of Ridgeville was settling in for the night. Thermostats were cranked up to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Furnaces roared to life, fighting the creeping chill outside. Televisions glowed through frosted windows. Mayor Buckley sat in his spacious, drafty Victorian home, sipping a scotch, watching the local news anchor point to a terrifyingly dark purple blob covering the weather map. "This isn't just a storm, folks," the anchorman said, his voice trembling slightly. "This is an atmospheric river of pure Arctic air. We are anticipating wind chills approaching -75 degrees. Do not travel. Do not go outside. Frostbite can occur on exposed skin in less than 3 minutes." Buckley turned off the TV, feeling a brief icy prickle of unease down his spine. He walked to his window and looked up toward the ridge. He could just barely make out the dark curved silhouette of Tristan's steel structure against the night sky. "Crazy old bastard," Buckley muttered to himself, pulling his thick wool cardigan tighter. He walked over to his digital thermostat and bumped it up another 3 degrees. The furnace in the basement rumbled a comforting, heavy sound. But outside, the wind was beginning to scream. The calm was over. The Siberian Express had arrived. It hit at 2:14 a.m. It didn't start with snow. It started with a sound that witnesses later described as a freight train tearing through the sky. A wall of ultra-dense, hyper-chilled air slammed into the Bitterroot Valley at 80 miles per hour. The temperature in Ridgeville dropped 42 degrees in the span of an hour. Trees that had stood for a century instantly crystallized and shattered under the immense pressure of the wind and the flash freezing of their internal sap. The air was filled with a blinding, terrifying whiteout, not from falling snow, but from ice crystals instantly freezing out of the atmospheric moisture and being whipped around like billions of microscopic razors. Inside Tristan's cabin, he awoke to a low, resonant hum. The wind was slamming into the steel shell of the Quonset hut with unimaginable fury, but because of the curved aerodynamic shape of the structure, the wind was forced to flow over it rather than pushing against flat walls. The steel vibrated a deep bass note that vibrated through the floorboards, but inside the wooden cabin, the air was entirely still. Tristan threw off his blanket and walked into his living room in his bare feet. He looked at the digital thermometer mounted on his wall. Interior cabin. Temp 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He grabbed a flashlight, unlocked his heavy wooden front door, and stepped into the 4-foot atrium gap. It was cooler here, but the blast of cold he expected never came. He checked the thermometer mounted to the steel inner wall of the Quonset. Atrium temp 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Then he looked at the external sensor wired to the outside of the steel shell. Outside, temp -48 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill -72 degrees Fahrenheit. Tristan exhaled a long, shaky breath. The physics were holding. The enormous temperature differential was staggering. His inner cabin was literally 116 degrees warmer than the outside air, and he hadn't even loaded the wood stove yet. The hundreds of black water barrels were doing their job, acting as a massive thermal battery, slowly bleeding the heat they had stored during the day into the dead airspace, fighting back the terrifying cold radiating through the steel. The outer shell absorbed the brutal wind, preventing the convective heat loss that strips warmth away from conventional houses. Down in the valley, a catastrophe was unfolding in real time. The electrical grid was never designed to handle the sheer volume of power surging through it, as every single furnace, electric heater, and baseboard in the county fought the plunging temperatures. At 2:45 a.m., the Millers Creek substation, the very one Tristan had warned Greg about, experienced a catastrophic failure. A massive transformer, its cooling oil, turned to thick sludge by the cold, overheated from the massive electrical load, and exploded in a brilliant shower of blue-white sparks that lit up the frozen valley. Instantly, Ridgeville plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. In Mayor Buckley's Victorian home, the comforting rumble of the basement furnace abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. Buckley shot out of bed, fumbling for his phone. He tried to turn on his bedside lamp. Nothing. He checked his phone. There was no cellular signal. The cell towers, heavily reliant on grid power and backed up by batteries that were now freezing solid, were dropping completely offline. Without the furnace forcing hot air through the vents, the cold did not just seep into the houses of Ridgeville, it invaded aggressively. Within 30 minutes, the temperature inside Buckley's house dropped from 72 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin traditional fiberglass insulation in his walls was no match for the negative 48-degree vacuum outside. Across town, Greg Mitchell woke up shivering violently. He reached over to his nightstand where his brand-new electric space heater sat dead and cold. He stumbled to his window. A thick, opaque layer of frost had already formed on the inside of the glass. He pressed his hand against the wall of his expertly built log cabin. The wood felt like blocks of dry ice. Panic, primal and desperate, began to take hold of the town. People were trapped. The roads were impassable, buried under feet of drifting snow and slick with black ice. Car batteries were frozen entirely solid, their internal fluids cracked. To step outside meant risking frostbite in minutes and hypothermia shortly after. By 6 a.m., the interior temperatures in most Ridgeville homes had dropped below freezing. Pipes began to burst, spraying water that instantly turned into chaotic sculptures of ice in living rooms and kitchens. Families huddled under piles of blankets, wearing winter coats, boots, and gloves in their own beds, their breath pluming in thick white clouds. Sarah Jenkins, wrapped in 2 down comforters in her small apartment above the diner, felt a terrifying lethargy washing over her. Her toes were numb. The water in the glass next to her bed was frozen solid, the glass cracked down the middle. She knew with a creeping dread that if the power didn't come back soon, people were going to start dying. Meanwhile, high on the ridge, Tristan Penfield sat at his kitchen table. He was wearing a simple cotton t-shirt and flannel pants. He poured boiling water from his whistling kettle into a ceramic mug, the steam rising warmly into the air, carrying the scent of Earl Grey tea. He walked to the window of his wooden cabin and looked out through the polycarbonate panels of the steel shell. The world outside was a violent, swirling nightmare of white and gray. But inside, it was quiet. It was safe. He didn't know yet that the grid was completely dead. He didn't know that the town that had mocked him for 3 years was currently freezing to death in the dark. All Tristan knew was that Nora's memory was safe. He had finally beaten the cold. Morning broke over Ridgeville not with the gentle warming rays of a winter sunrise, but with a sterile, blinding glare that offered absolutely zero heat. The sky was an empty, cloudless dome of pale, icy blue, swept entirely clean by the relentless violence of the polar vortex. The wind had dropped from an 80-mile-per-hour howl to a steady, agonizing 40-mile-per-hour blade, but the ambient temperature had plummeted even further. The digital thermometer at the town's bank, powered by a dying backup battery, flashed a number that made no sense to the human eye, minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the homes of Ridgeville, the reality of the grid collapse was setting in with terrifying finality. The houses designed to trap heat generated by constant mechanical force had become nothing more than wooden ice boxes. Without the internal pressure of forced hot air, the negative 50-degree vacuum outside had violently invaded through every microscopic crack, poorly sealed window, and uninsulated crawlspace. Sarah Jenkins lay on the floor of her living room, wrapped in a sleeping bag, 2 wool blankets, and her heavy winter parka. She had dragged her mattress from the bedroom into the smaller, more enclosed living room, hoping to contain her body heat. It wasn't working. The moisture from her own breath had frozen to the nylon shell of her sleeping bag, creating a stiff, crackling crust of ice right in front of her face. She forced her eyes open. Her eyelashes stuck together, rimed with frost. She tried to move her legs, but they felt heavy, disconnected, like blocks of cement buried deep under the covers. The temperature inside her apartment had fallen to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The water in her toilet bowl was a solid block of ice, expanding so violently that the porcelain had fractured down the middle with a sharp crack that had echoed like a gunshot in the middle of the night. A mile away, Mayor Thomas Buckley was sitting at his grand mahogany dining table in his Victorian home, staring blankly at a useless dead landline phone. His breath plumed in the freezing air of his kitchen. He was wearing his expensive cashmere overcoat, leather gloves, and a hunting cap with ear flaps. He'd spent the last 2 hours trying to start a fire in his decorative gas fireplace, but the safety valves required electricity to open the flues. He had foolishly burned a pile of old newspapers in an aluminum trash can in the center of the kitchen floor, only to nearly asphyxiate himself with carbon monoxide because he couldn't open a window to ventilate. The sashes were frozen entirely shut by condensation. Buckley rubbed his face with gloved hands. He was the mayor. He was supposed to have a contingency plan, but the emergency generators at the town hall and the firehouse were rated for 20 below, not 50 below. Their diesel fuel had gelled into thick wax. The town's single snowplow couldn't start. Ridgeville was completely paralyzed. High above the misery of the valley, Tristan Penfield was finishing his breakfast. He washed his plate in the sink using water pumped from his deep geothermally warmed well. He walked over to his communications desk, a small alcove in his cabin, lined with ham radio equipment and a police scanner, all wired directly to his independent solar battery bank tucked safely inside the warm atrium. Tristan switched on the emergency weather band. The automated voice of the NOAA broadcast was devoid of emotion, making the apocalyptic update sound even more terrifying. Catastrophic failure of the regional power grid. Bitterroot Valley and surrounding counties are currently without power. Utility officials estimate restoration efforts cannot begin until wind chills rise above -30 degrees. Residents are advised to shelter in place. Do not attempt vehicular travel. Emergency services are currently suspended due to mechanical failures. Extreme danger of hypothermia and frostbite. Repeat emergency services are suspended. Tristan's hand hovered over the dial. He slowly lowered it. The grid was dead. The trucks couldn't run. The helicopters couldn't fly. He stood up and walked to the polycarbonate window of his steel shell, looking down through the trees at the valley below. Usually he could see the thin gray wisps of wood smoke curling from dozens of chimneys or the glint of cars moving along the highway. Today the town was a silent white tomb. Tristan looked at his internal thermometer. 69 degrees Fahrenheit. His massive thermal battery, the hundreds of black 55-gallon drums filled with water, had done exactly what he had engineered them to do. During the brief hours of pale sunlight, they absorbed the faint solar radiation through the southern windows. At night, as the temperature inside the atrium naturally tried to drop, the water slowly released its stored energy into the dead air space. The steel shell took the brutal convective beating of the wind, leaving the wooden cabin inside untouched by the draft. It was a perfect passive thermal envelope. He had burned exactly 2 logs in his high-efficiency stove over the last 12 hours. Tristan closed his eyes. The phantom pain in his amputated toes throbbed, a brutal reminder of the night he lost Nora. He remembered the feeling of his blood slowing down, the uncontrollable violent shivering that eventually gave way to a terrifying, warm lethargy. He knew exactly what the people down in that valley were feeling right now. They laughed at you, a bitter voice whispered in his mind. Let them freeze. But Tristan wasn't a cruel man. He was a traumatized one. And as he stared down at the frozen roofs of Ridgeville, the face of his late wife superimposed itself over the town. He couldn't sit in his 69-degree sanctuary while children froze to death a mile down the road. Greg Mitchell's log cabin, usually a point of immense pride, had betrayed him. Logs, while beautiful, possess incredibly low thermal mass and poor insulation values compared to modern synthetics. Once the heat source was gone, the cold tore through the timber joints like water through a sieve. It was 9 a.m. Inside the master bedroom, Greg was huddled under a mountain of blankets with his wife Cynthia and their two children, 10-year-old Billy and 7-year-old Megan. "Daddy, it hurts!" Megan whimpered, her voice barely a squeak. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. Greg pulled her tighter against his chest, his own body racked with violent, exhausting shivers. "I know, baby, I know. We just have to stay close." He looked at Cynthia. Her eyes were glazed, half open. She wasn't shivering anymore. A jolt of pure adrenaline-fueled terror pierced through Greg's freezing fog. He knew the stages of hypothermia. When the shivering stops, the body is given up. The core is shutting down to protect the vital organs, and death is not far behind. "We are going to die today," Greg thought, "right here in this bed." His mind raced desperately, searching for a solution. The cars were dead. The roads were impassable. The neighbors were in the exact same situation. Then a metallic image flashed in his mind. "This isn't a house, it's a thermos." Tristan's words echoed in his memory. The tin can. The crazy old man with his Mylar tape and his black water barrels. Greg had stood in Miller's Hardware and publicly mocked the man. He had bet his family's life on the power grid, and Tristan had bet his on physics. Tristan had won. Greg knew that if there was one place on this mountain that wasn't a freezing tomb, it was up that ridge. "Cynthia," Greg croaked, shaking his wife roughly. "Cynthia, stay awake. Do not fall asleep." He threw off the covers. The 10 degrees Fahrenheit air of his bedroom hit him like physical punches. He moved with frantic, clumsy speed, layering on every piece of clothing he could find thermal underwear, 2 wool sweaters, his heavy Carhartt jacket, 2 pairs of thick hunting socks, heavy boots, a ski mask, and ski goggles. Where are you going?" Cynthia mumbled her words, slurring. "I'm going to get help. I'm going to Tristan's." Greg said, his jaw locked in a permanent clench against the cold. "Keep the kids under you. Do not move. I'll be back." Greg stumbled down the stairs, every joint in his body screaming in protest. He forced open his front door, having to body slam it to break the ice seal that had formed around the frame. The moment he stepped off his porch, the Arctic air swallowed him whole. The wind chill was sitting at minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold so profound, so absolute, that it felt like burning fire against the tiny slivers of exposed skin on his face. Every breath he took felt like inhaling crushed glass. The freezing air immediately began pulling moisture from his lungs, causing him to hack violently. Tristan's property was only half a mile up a steep, winding gravel road. On a warm summer day, it was a brisk 20-minute hike. Today it was an ascent into Everest's death zone. The snow was thigh-deep crusted with a hard layer of ice that broke under his weight, tearing at his shins. Greg put his head down, leading with his shoulder against the relentless wind. 10 minutes in, he couldn't feel his feet. 15 minutes in, his hands inside thick gloves felt like wooden blocks. "Keep moving," he chanted in his head. "Megan is blue. Cynthia isn't shivering. Keep moving." He fell. The wind caught him off balance, and he tumbled face first into a snowbank. He lay there for a moment. It was so quiet down in the snow. It would be so easy to just close his eyes for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes of rest. The terrifying lethargy of severe hypothermia was singing its siren song. Then he remembered laughing at Tristan in the hardware store. He remembered the smug certainty he had felt. The shame burned hotter than the cold. He roared in defiance, a pitiful, muffled sound, and pushed himself back up on his wooden legs. 45 minutes later, he crested the final rise. Through the blowing whiteout, the massive curved silhouette of the Quonset hut emerged. It wasn't covered in snow. The fierce wind had scoured the smooth aerodynamic steel completely bare. It looked like an alien spacecraft landed in a frozen wasteland. Greg stumbled across the driveway, his vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. He reached the massive steel submarine-style door Tristan had installed. He raised a heavy frozen fist and banged on the metal. The sound was instantly ripped away by the wind. He banged again harder, screaming Tristan's name, but his voice was a weak croak. He slumped against the frozen steel door, his energy entirely spent. He slid down to the ground, his back against the metal. "I'm sorry, Sin," he thought, his eyes fluttering shut. "I tried." Suddenly the steel behind him vibrated. There was a heavy clank of a deadbolt sliding back. The massive door swung outward, pushed by a hydraulic arm, and Greg fell backward onto a hard rubber mat. Strong hands grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and hauled him roughly over the threshold. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the shriek of the wind with a definitive airtight thud. Greg lay on the floor, gasping for air. His brain couldn't process the sudden sensory shift. There was no wind. There was no blinding white light. And then he felt it. It was subtle at first, a gentle pressing sensation against his frozen cheeks. It was the ambient air. He slowly pushed his ski goggles up. He was lying in a wide, curved corridor. The inner wall was solid corrugated steel, glowing softly with condensation. The outer wall, 4 feet away, was the beautiful varnished timber of Tristan's cabin. Stacked everywhere were black water barrels. Greg looked at a thermometer mounted on the timber wall right next to his head. 55 degrees Fahrenheit. To a man whose core temperature was flirting with 90 degrees, 55 degrees felt like a tropical resort. He began to sob, his body shaking violently as the relatively warm air began to thaw his nerve endings, sending waves of excruciating pins and needles through his extremities. Tristan stood over him holding a heavy wool blanket. He looked down at the contractor who had mocked him relentlessly. There was no smugness in Tristan's eyes, only grim realization. "Drink this," Tristan said gently, kneeling down and holding a thermos cup of lukewarm sugar water to Greg's lips. "Slowly. Don't shock your stomach." Greg choked down the liquid. It tasted like life itself. "Tristan." Greg stammered, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might crack. "My family, Cynthia, the kids, dying, the whole town?" Tristan nodded slowly. He stood up and looked at the heavy steel door. "I know, Greg," Tristan said quietly. "Let's get you inside the cabin. We have a lot of work to do." Tristan helped Greg stumble through the secondary door, a heavy insulated timber slab, and into the main living space of the wooden cabin. The shift was instantaneous and staggering. From the 55 degrees Fahrenheit safety of the atrium, they stepped into a pocket of air that was sitting at a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The air smelled of cedar and faint wood smoke. A small cast-iron stove sat in the corner, radiating a steady, powerful heat that made Greg's frozen face throb with returning circulation. Greg collapsed onto Tristan's leather sofa. He couldn't stop shaking. The severe temperature change was shocking his system, a painful but necessary thaw. Tristan efficiently draped 2 heavy heated electric blankets over him, powered directly from his massive solar storage bank. "Keep your boots on until your toes start burning," Tristan commanded, moving to the kitchen to boil water. "If we warm your extremities too fast, the cold blood will rush back to your heart and put you into cardiac arrest, slow and steady." Greg watched Tristan move around the kitchen. There was no giant roaring furnace. There were no massive generators vibrating the floorboards. It was just quiet, still-trapped warmth. "How?" Greg whispered, his voice cracking. "How is it this warm in here?" Tristan poured hot water over tea leaves in a large mug. "Thermal mass, Greg. I told you. The sun heats the water barrels in the gap. The metal shell blocks the wind. The air in the gap acts as a buffer. The heat inside this wooden cabin has nowhere to go. It can't escape through the walls because the air outside the walls is already trapped in 55 degrees. It's a closed loop." Tristan handed Greg the mug. "Drink. Then tell me exactly what's happening down there." Greg gripped the mug with both hands, letting the ceramic burn his numb palms. He took a sip, the hot tea tracing a line of fire down his throat. "It's a graveyard, Tristan." Greg sobbed, his pride entirely shattered. The man who prided himself on being the toughest builder in Ridgeville was weeping openly into a cup of tea. The substation blew around 2 a.m. Total grid collapse. Every house down there is an icebox. It was 14 degrees in my bedroom when I left. Cynthia stopped shivering. My little girl's lips were blue. If they don't get heat in the next 2 hours, they won't make it. Tristan sat down in the armchair opposite Greg. The phantom pain in his feet flared violently. He was looking at Greg, but he was seeing Nora. He was seeing the frost on her eyelashes as she slowly went to sleep in the passenger seat of their trapped car. "Tristan, I'm so sorry," Greg pleaded, looking up with bloodshot, desperate eyes. "I'm sorry I laughed at you. I'm sorry the whole town laughed at you. You were right. You were absolutely right. Please, you have to help us. Please." Tristan closed his eyes. He took a deep, centering breath. "I didn't build this to prove a point, Greg," Tristan said quietly. "I built this so I would never have to watch someone freeze to death again." He stood up, his mind instantly shifting from passive survivor to active engineer. "We have a problem," Tristan said, pacing the floor. "This thermal envelope relies on a delicate balance. It's designed to hold the heat of 1, maybe 2 people plus the ambient solar radiation and the stove. If we bring 50 people up here every time we open that massive steel door, we lose hundreds of cubic feet of 55-degree air from the atrium. We let the negative 50-degree air inside. If we break the thermal buffer, the cold will eventually eat through the wooden walls of this cabin." Greg paled. "So, you can't take us—" "I didn't say that," Tristan snapped, stopping his pacing. "I'm doing the math. Human bodies generate roughly 100 watts of heat at rest. If we bring people into the atrium, their body heat will actually contribute to the thermal mass. But we have to manage the airlock. We can't have people walking in one by one. We have to bring them in groups, minimize the door cycles." Tristan walked over to his gear closet and threw open the doors. Inside were rows of heavy-duty Arctic exploration gear, battery-heated base layers, specialized parkas, rated for negative 80 degrees oxygen deprivation masks to warm inhaled air, and heavy traction cleats. "We don't have time to walk them up one by one," Tristan said, pulling out 2 massive heavy-duty utility sleds. They were the kind used by snowmobilers to haul hundreds of pounds of timber reinforced with high-density polyethylene runners. "Are those—" Greg started. "Okay. We're going to use gravity," Tristan said, tossing a heated base layer at Greg. "I have a battery-powered winch mounted on the front porch. We take the sleds down empty. We load the most critical people first: children, the elderly, your wife. We hook the sleds to the winch cable and the winch drags them up the mountain. It's faster than walking and it requires 0 physical exertion from the victims." Greg stared at the old man. Tristan wasn't a crackpot. He was a general preparing for war, and he had spent 3 years stockpiling the perfect armory. "Put that heated suit on over your clothes," Tristan ordered, strapping on his own gear. "Your core temperature is stabilized, but you're going back into the death zone. You have exactly 30 minutes of functional mobility outside before the cold starts locking your joints again. We move fast, we don't speak outside to save our lungs, and we don't stop moving." Greg quickly stripped off his outer layers and pulled on the battery-heated suit. As soon as Tristan clicked the power pack on, a glorious artificial heat flooded Greg's body. "Tristan," Greg said, fastening the heavy parka over the suit, "why are you risking your life to go back out there after everything we said about you?" Tristan pulled his heavy neoprene face mask up over his nose, leaving only his pale blue eyes visible. He looked at the framed photograph of Nora sitting on his mantelpiece. "Because a house is just a building." "Greg," Tristan said, his voice muffled by the thick mask, "it only becomes a sanctuary when it keeps the people you care about safe. Let's go steal some souls back from the ice." Tristan grabbed the heavy tow cables, kicked open the inner wooden door, and stepped into the 55 degrees Fahrenheit air of the atrium. Greg followed closely behind the 2 heavy sleds trailing them. They reached the massive outer steel door. Tristan gripped the heavy locking mechanism. He looked at Greg and gave a single firm nod. Tristan pulled the lever, and the heavy door swung open instantly, unleashing the deafening, shrieking howl of the polar vortex. The whiteout violently consumed them as they stepped out of the tin can sanctuary and plunged down the mountain toward a dying town. The moment the heavy steel door slammed shut behind them, sealing off the 55-degree sanctuary, the sheer brutality of the storm reasserted itself. The wind did not merely blow, it battered them with physical concussive force. It was a solid wall of kinetic energy and microscopic ice shards. Tristan Penfield led the way, a thick braided steel winch cable clipped securely to a heavy-duty carabiner on his harness. The winch bolted securely to the reinforced timber decking of the cabin's front porch and powered by a dedicated deep-cycle marine battery bank indoors, unspooled with a faint metallic whine that was instantly swallowed by the roaring gale. Behind Tristan, Greg Mitchell dragged the two heavy polyethylene survival sleds. Even with the battery-heated suits pumping warmth against their skin, the ambient negative 65-degree wind chill was aggressively hunting for vulnerabilities. It sought out the tiny millimeter gaps around their goggles, the seams of their heavy zippers, and the edges of their neoprene face masks. "Stay directly in my tracks," Tristan bellowed, though his voice sounded like a whisper to Greg through the howling void. The descent was agonizing. Normally walking downhill is easier, but the snow was crusted with a deceitful layer of hard ice that shattered under their weight, plunging them thigh-deep into frozen powder with every step. The winch cable dragged behind them, a silver lifeline cutting through the whiteout, keeping them tethered to the only warm place in a 50-mile radius. It took them 22 minutes to reach Greg's property. By the time they arrived, Greg's heated suit was struggling to maintain its output against the catastrophic external cold. The battery indicator on his chest flashed a dull warning yellow. They reached the front porch of the log cabin. Greg didn't bother trying the door handle. He knew it was frozen solid. He threw his entire weight against the heavy timber door, his shoulders screaming in protest as the ice seal fractured with a loud crack. The interior of the house was a nightmare of silent, creeping death. The temperature inside had plummeted to 8 degrees above zero. The air was entirely devoid of moisture stinging their lungs. Thick, feathery patterns of hoarfrost covered the interior walls, the family portraits, and the television screen. The water pipes in the ceiling had burst hours ago, creating massive, jagged stalactites of ice that hung from the drywall like teeth in a cavern. Greg tore off his goggles, panic surging through him. He sprinted up the stairs, his heavy boots thudding against the frozen wood, with Tristan right behind him, carrying a massive thermal sleeping bag. "Cynthia!" Greg screamed, sliding into the master bedroom. The mound of blankets on the bed was entirely still. Greg tore them back. Cynthia lay curled in a fetal position, her skin a terrifying translucent shade of gray. 7-year-old Megan was tucked under her arm, completely unresponsive, her lips the color of bruised plums. 10-year-old Billy was conscious but trapped in a state of severe, uncontrollable tremors, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Tristan, they're dead! They're dying!" Greg sobbed, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't grasp his wife's shoulders. "Move!" Tristan commanded, his voice slicing through the panic with surgical precision. He shoved Greg aside and unrolled the heavy-duty foil-lined Arctic sleeping bag. "Grab the boy. Put him in the bag with the girl. Body heat needs to be shared. Now, Greg." Greg snapped out of his shock. He grabbed his son, who felt like a block of rigid wood, and shoved him into the bottom of the thermal bag. Tristan gently but swiftly lifted Megan, placing her against her brother. Finally, they lifted Cynthia. She let out a low, agonizing moan as her stiff joints were forced to move. She's alive," Tristan grunted, zipping the heavy bag up to their necks and securing the thermal hood. "But her core temp is crashing. We have maybe 15 minutes before organ failure." They carried the cocooned family down the stairs, struggling to maneuver the heavy, awkward load. They laid the bag gently into the first polyethylene sled. Tristan quickly threw thick nylon ratchet straps over them, securing them tightly to the sled's runners. "We can't drag them," Greg yelled over the wind as they stepped back onto the porch. "It took us 20 minutes to get down. Going up will take an hour." Tristan didn't answer. He reached down to the remote control module clipped to his belt, heavily insulated against the cold. He flipped the safety cover up and slammed his thumb onto the large red retract button. Half a mile up the mountain, hidden inside the steel atrium, massive electric relays clicked closed. The heavy-duty winch motor roared to life, drawing hundreds of amps from the solar battery bank. The braided steel cable on Tristan's harness instantly went taut, snapping straight with a sharp twang. "Clip the sled to the main line," Tristan ordered. Greg fumbled with the thick steel carabiner, his thick gloves making him clumsy. He finally snapped the sled's tow line to the main winch cable. "Clear!" Greg yelled. Tristan adjusted the dial on his remote. The sled lurched forward. Powered by the immense torque of the electric winch, the sled began to carve a smooth, rapid path up the mountain, sliding over the treacherous snowpack with mechanical ease. It was moving at a brisk walking pace, pulling the freezing family toward the sky. "Grab the cable," Tristan yelled, clipping his own harness back onto the line. "Let the motor do the work. We just walk behind it and steer." Dragged up the mountain by the relentless power of the winch, their ascent took exactly 8 minutes. When they reached the massive steel door of the Quonset hut, Tristan rapidly tapped a code into a heavy weatherproof keypad. The hydraulic deadbolts clanked, and the door swung open. They hauled the sled over the threshold and immediately slammed the steel door shut. The deafening roar of the storm vanished. The blessed still air of the atrium enveloped them. Atrium temp, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Tristan immediately checked the thermometer. They had lost 3 degrees of ambient heat in the 90 seconds the door was open. It was a mathematical reality he had to manage carefully. They rushed the sled into the main wooden cabin, where the wood stove was radiating a glorious 70 degrees Fahrenheit heat. Greg fell to his knees, unzipping the heavy bag. Cynthia took a sudden, deep, shuddering gasp. The warmth of the cabin hit her face, and her eyes fluttered open. Billy began to cry a weak, raspy sound, but a beautiful one. Megan's eyelids twitched. "Don't put them right next to the stove," Tristan warned quickly, grabbing his medical kit. "Peripheral vasodilation. If they warm up too fast, their blood pressure will tank. Keep them in the center of the room. Let the ambient air do the work." Greg collapsed onto the floor beside his family, weeping uncontrollably, kissing his wife's freezing forehead. Tristan didn't stop. He checked the battery levels on his winch remote. He swapped his own internal heated battery pack for a fresh one, charging on the desk. "Greg," Tristan said, his voice flat and absolute, "your family is safe, but we have 2,800 people in that valley. The triage clock is ticking. I need you to stay here, feed the stove exactly 1 log every 45 minutes, and watch them." Greg looked up. "Where are you going?" "Down," Tristan said, clipping his harness back on. "There's a town dying in the dark." For the next 10 hours, Tristan Penfield waged a mechanized, brutal war against the polar vortex. He made 7 separate trips down the mountain, relying entirely on the electric winch to haul the heavy sleds back up. The physical toll was unimaginable. Even with the heated suit, the constant exposure to the negative 60-degree wind chill was beginning to cause severe frostnip on his cheeks and nose. His joints ached with a deep bone-grinding pain. His second trip brought back Sarah Jenkins, the diner owner, who he found curled up in her kitchen pantry, nearly comatose. His third trip secured Dr. Harrison Caldwell, the town's only general practitioner, and his teenage daughter, Emma. When Dr. Caldwell arrived in the Tin Can Sanctuary and saw the setup, his professional instincts immediately took over. He recognized the genius of the passive thermal design and quickly transformed Tristan's living room into a critical care ward. "Tristan, this is a miracle," Dr. Caldwell said, assessing Sarah Jenkins's vitals. "But we have a critical logistics problem. Your inner cabin is maxed out. If you put any more bodies in here, we won't have room to work." "I know," Tristan rasped, swallowing a handful of ibuprofen. "The next group stay in the atrium, the 50-degree air gap." 50 degrees is barely above hypothermic threshold for people already exposed, Caldwell argued. "Eat? It's better than negative 60, Tristan countered. "And there's a secondary variable. Human bodies are radiators. Every person we put in that atrium generates 100 watts of thermal energy. If we bring up 30 people, that's 3,000 watts of constant radiant heat trapped inside the metal shell. Their body heat will stabilize the temperature drop from opening the airlock." Caldwell stared at him, realizing the old structural engineer had calculated the literal thermal output of the human soul. On Tristan's 8th trip, he aimed for the large Victorian home of Mayor Thomas Buckley. He found the front door unlocked, the heavy wood warped by the cold. Inside, the air was not just freezing, it was thick and acrid. Tristan's battery-powered carbon monoxide detector clipped to his shoulder began to shriek instantly. He held his breath and kicked open the kitchen door. The room was black with soot. Mayor Buckley was slumped against the kitchen cabinets, a burned-out aluminum trash can sitting in the center of the floor. In his desperation for heat, Buckley had burned trash indoors and poisoned himself. Tristan dragged the heavy, unconscious man out onto the front porch, forcing him into the cold, oxygen-rich air. Buckley was barely breathing, his skin cherry red from carbon monoxide saturation, and simultaneously gray from hypothermia. Tristan loaded him into the sled, strapped him down, and hit the winch button. By nightfall of the second day, the impossible had happened. The tin can had become a refugee camp. There were 42 people crammed onto Tristan's property. 12 of the most critical cases, including Cynthia Mitchell, the mayor, and several children, were laid out on the floor of the wooden cabin, monitored by Dr. Caldwell. The remaining 30 people were sitting shoulder to shoulder in the 4-foot-wide atrium, the space between the wooden cabin and the corrugated steel Quonset shell. It was tight, claustrophobic, and entirely dark, save for a few battery-powered lanterns. They sat on heavy rubber mats wrapped in whatever blankets Tristan had stockpiled. Outside, the steel shell vibrated violently under the constant, unrelenting assault of the 80-mile-per-hour winds. It sounded like they were sitting inside a massive ringing bell, but inside the gap there was no wind, and Tristan's math had been flawless. He stood at the door, separating his inner cabin from the atrium, and looked at the digital thermometer mounted on the steel wall. Atrium temp 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The collective body heat of 30 terrified, huddled people radiating against the mylar-taped steel, and the black water barrels had actually raised the temperature of the dead air gap by 9 degrees. The massive structure was absorbing their life force and reflecting it right back at them, creating a perfect, self-sustaining microclimate. Greg Mitchell sat in the atrium holding a steaming cup of soup, looking at the curved steel wall inches from his face. He reached out and touched the icy metal. Just millimeters on the other side of that thin sheet of steel was a cold that would kill him in 3 minutes. But here he was sweating in his heavy coat. He looked down the curved corridor at Tristan, who was exhausted, leaning against the doorframe. "Tristan." Greg called out, his voice echoing slightly in the metal tube. The other 29 people went dead silent, looking at the man they had relentlessly mocked for years. "We owe you our lives," Greg said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everyone here, we thought you were crazy. We were the fools." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the packed atrium. Sarah Jenkins weakly raised a hand from her blanket pile. Tristan looked at the weary, traumatized faces of his neighbors. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt an immense, crushing wave of relief that they were breathing. "Conserve your energy, Greg," Tristan said softly. "The storm isn't over yet. We have to survive tomorrow." The third day brought a new, entirely unforeseen terror. It wasn't the cold. It was the air itself. The polar vortex showed no signs of breaking. The outside temperature remained locked at a lethal minus 54 degrees Fahrenheit, with the wind howling like a wounded animal. The grid remained dead. The town below was a frozen graveyard of empty houses. Inside the Quonset hut, the delicate ecosystem of Tristan's thermal envelope was beginning to turn hostile. At 10 a.m., Dr. Caldwell approached Tristan in the inner cabin. The doctor looked pale, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit temperature of the room. "Tristan, I have a massive headache, and look at the patients," Caldwell said quietly, pointing to Mayor Buckley and Cynthia Mitchell. They were breathing rapidly, their chests heaving, despite being unconscious or asleep. Tristan frowned. He walked over to his weather station monitor on the desk and switched the display from temperature to air quality. His blood ran cold. CO2, level 3,800 parts per million. Normal atmospheric carbon monoxide is around 400 parts per million. Anything above 2,000 parts per million causes severe headaches, lethargy, and cognitive impairment. Above 5,000 parts per million toxicity sets in, leading to unconsciousness and eventual asphyxiation. We are breathing our own exhaust. Tristan realized a knot of panic tightening his stomach. 42 human beings constantly exhaling in a perfectly hermetically sealed, mylar-taped steel tube. They were rapidly depleting the oxygen and replacing it with carbon dioxide. The structure that was saving them from the freezing cold was slowly suffocating them to death. The roof vents, Tristan said, immediately moving to a mechanical hand crank bolted to the wall. I engineered manual louvers at the very apex of the Quonset shell. If I open them, the heavy CO2 will be forced out by the pressure differential, and fresh air will sink in. He grabbed the heavy iron crank handle and threw his weight into it. The gears shrieked, grinding against each other with a horrible metal-on-metal scream, but the crank didn't turn. It was locked solid. Tristan swore violently, a rare occurrence that made Dr. Caldwell jump. "What's wrong?" Caldwell asked, rubbing his temples as the headache intensified. "Condensation." Tristan gritted his teeth, leaning his entire body weight onto the crank. 30 people in the atrium are exhaling massive amounts of water vapor. That vapor has risen to the top of the steel shell, hit the negative 50-degree metal near the vents, and flash frozen. The louvers are welded shut by solid ice. Greg Mitchell stepped into the cabin from the atrium, looking dizzy and disoriented. "Tristan, people in the back are passing out. The air's too thick." "We have to open the main steel door," Dr. Caldwell said. "We need to flush the air." If we open that massive door, we lose all our thermal mass in seconds," Tristan countered rapidly. "The negative 50-degree air will sweep in and drop the atrium temperature below freezing instantly. Half the people out there are already bordering on hypothermic shock. Flushing the air will kill them with the cold before the CO2 does." Tristan looked up at the ceiling. The only way out was up. "I have to break the ice on the louvers," Tristan said, grabbing his heavy ice axe from his gear closet. "You're going on the roof," Greg gasped. "In this wind, it will blow you right off the steel curve." "Not outside," Tristan said, stripping off his heavy coat and pulling on a pair of tight insulated climbing gloves. "Inside, through the atrium gap." He rushed out into the atrium. The air here was noticeably thicker, foul-smelling and heavy. People were slumped against the water barrels, gasping weakly. Tristan pushed his way to the back of the curved structure. He wedged his body between the massive black water barrels and the curved steel wall. Because the Quonset was a half-cylinder, the highest point was 20 feet directly above them. The only way up was to use the exposed steel ribs of the inner Quonset frame as a ladder, climbing the curve until he was hanging upside down over the ceiling of his wooden cabin. "Tristan, you're 64, Greg yelled, his voice weak. "You can't free climb that." "Watch me," Tristan growled. He reached up, grabbing the cold steel rib, and hauled himself upward. His boots scrambled for purchase on the smooth condensation-slicked metal. He climbed higher, 10 feet, 15 feet. The steel was freezing his hands right through his gloves. He reached the apex. He was essentially hanging horizontally in the 4-foot gap above his wooden cabin, his back pressed against the frozen steel ceiling, his legs wrapped around a support rib to keep from falling. Directly above his face were the mechanical louvers. They were encased in a block of solid, milky white ice 3 inches thick. His lungs burned. The CO2 concentration at the ceiling was even higher. Black spots danced in his vision. He knew he was seconds away from passing out and plummeting 20 feet onto the wooden roof below. Tristan swung the ice axe awkwardly in the tight space. Clang! The axe bounced off the ice. He swung again, harder, putting every ounce of his failing strength into it. Crack! A spiderweb of fractures appeared in the ice. His grip on the steel rib was slipping. The phantom pain in his toes screamed. He thought of Nora. He thought of her suffocating in that frozen car. "Not today!" Tristan roared, completely fueled by adrenaline and rage. He swung the axe a third time, burying the heavy steel pick deep into the center of the mechanism. He wrenched the handle violently to the side. With a sound like a shotgun blast, the ice block shattered. The pressure differential was instantaneous and violent. The moment the louvers cracked open, the hyper-dense -50-degree air from outside violently shoved its way in, pushing the warm, heavy CO2-laden air out of the vents. A localized blizzard of fresh, freezing, highly oxygenated air blasted directly into Tristan's face. It was shocking, agonizingly cold and absolute heaven. Tristan gasped, filling his lungs with pure oxygen. He let go of the axe, sliding down the curvature of the steel wall, a controlled, painful fall that landed him heavily on a pile of rubber mats in the atrium. Greg and Dr. Caldwell rushed over, dragging him away from the immediate blast of cold air falling from the ceiling. "It's working?" Dr. Caldwell laughed, coughing as the fresh air swept through the atrium. People who had been slumped over began sitting up, taking deep, greedy breaths. The temperature in the atrium dropped rapidly from 61 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But the air was clean. It was breathable. The thermal mass of the water barrels immediately began working to reheat the fresh air. Tristan lay on his back, staring up at the steel ceiling, his chest heaving. He had won. The beast had thrown everything it had at the tin can, and the tin can had held. 72 hours after the polar vortex first hit, the wind finally died. The morning of the fourth day dawned with a brilliant, blindingly clear sun. The temperature slowly crawled back up, crossing the 0-degree mark for the first time in nearly a week. Down in the valley, the silence was broken by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of twin-rotor Chinook helicopters. The military had been mobilized. The National Guard was finally breaching the isolated zones. Captain David Reynolds, piloting the lead rescue chopper, stared down at the frozen, dead town of Ridgeville through his thermal imaging camera. The screens in the cockpit showed a sea of dark blue and black, the colors of absolute zero heat signatures. There were no warm houses. There was no life. "Command, this is Rescue Actual." Reynolds spoke into his headset, his voice grim. "We have eyes on Ridgeville. No active thermal signatures in the main residential grid. It looks like a total casualty event." "Wait." Reynolds tapped his co-pilot's shoulder, pointing at the thermal screen. High up on the western ridge, separated from the dead town, there was a massive glowing beacon of bright, blinding yellow and red thermal energy. It was a perfect semicircle, radiating intense, impossible heat in a landscape of death. "Command correction," Reynolds said, banking the massive helicopter toward Tristan's property. "I have a massive thermal signature on the ridge. It looks like... I don't know what it looks like, but it's hot." When the National Guard ground teams finally plowed their way up the mountain and reached the property, they expected to find a military bunker or an industrial complex. Instead, they found a rusted, corrugated steel Quonset hut. And standing outside of it, blinking in the bright winter sun, were 42 survivors. They were unwashed, exhausted, and wearing a bizarre assortment of blankets and heated gear, but they were alive. At the center of the crowd stood Tristan Penfield. Captain Reynolds jumped down from a tracked transport vehicle and walked up to Tristan, looking in awe at the massive steel structure. "Sir," Captain Reynolds said, looking at the thermal scans on his tablet and then back at Tristan. "The ambient temperature is currently 5 degrees above zero. My thermal scan says the interior of this structure is sitting at 68 degrees. There are no power lines attached. There are no generator exhaust plumes. How in God's name did you do this?" Tristan looked at Greg Mitchell, who had his arm tightly wrapped around his recovering wife, Cynthia. He looked at Mayor Buckley, who was leaning heavily on a cane, looking humbled and broken. Then Tristan looked at the heavy steel door of his sanctuary. "Physics, Captain," Tristan said quietly, a faint exhausted smile touching his frost-nipped lips. "Just physics, and a whole lot of water barrels. The historic freeze of 2024 left a permanent scar on the Bitterroot Valley. While Ridgeville mourned the catastrophic losses from the grid failure, the survival of 42 people inside Tristan's tin can became a national phenomenon. The town that once mocked his ingenuity now viewed him as a savior. Tristan Penfield never rebuilt the grid connections to his house. He didn't need to. He proved that sometimes the most profound resilience isn't found in trusting fragile modern systems, but in respecting the raw power of nature and engineering a passive defense against it. Tristan's crazy Quonset hut stands today not as an eyesore, but as a monument to human adaptability. If this incredible true story of survival engineering and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves off-grid ingenuity, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life tales of human survival. Let us know in the comments, would you live in a Quonset-covered cabin?